The Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Hello and welcome to the Speaking of Cults podcast. This is Chris Shelton, your host. Thank you very much for joining me again this week. I am welcoming back Jonathan Stea, and he is, actually I'm just going to read right from his website. We're going to get right into this. Jonathan is a PhD full-time practicing clinical psychologist and adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Calgary. Canuck. And clinically, he specializes in the assessment and treatment of concurrent addiction and mental disorders, but he is also an author and writer of a book called Mind the Science, and a very, very strong advocate on social media and otherwise for fighting against pseudoscience. And so why am I having him on a show called Speaking of Cults? Because it just so happens that pseudoscientific thinking and a preponderance for pseudoscience and cult-like thinking go hand in hand. These things, we run into these things all the time. It is a matter of extremism of belief or commitment to a thing, and people get committed to things all the time. There's nothing wrong with commitment, but there is something wrong when you're doubling down, tripling down on things that are actually harmful for people. And that's what we really want to fight back against. We don't want people to not be well. Anyway, we're going to get right into this. So, Jonathan, welcome back to my show.
My pleasure, Chris. I enjoyed it last time, and I'm looking forward to today. I just love our chats.
Excellent. Yeah, me too. This is a topic that really is near and dear to my heart because having come out of Scientology, there are just mounds and mounds of pseudoscience in that group. And it's interesting to me that these groups, once you open the door to that within a cultic environment, it's almost contagious, and there's almost a sort of a other pseudoscientific practices easily come into the communities. I can't tell you how many food fads and health fads there were, ripping through the Scientology churches and the Sea organization, that real billionaire group I was part of. So it's raw food diets and MSM and some other chemical stuff and Chinese tea. I mean, all of these were huge rages while we were, when I was doing that stuff. What do you think? What's the state of this now? How would we talk about pseudoscience now? Has it lessened since the last time we spoke? Has it gotten worse? Is it about the same? What's your estimation on this?
Well, I think it's got way worse. And just to kind of backtrack for a bit, I mean, you're right insofar as, it's the same underlying psychological underpinnings that, lead people to fall into cults and conspiracy thinking and pseudoscience. And so that's why there is such a prevalence of pseudoscientific approaches or treatments in places like Scientology, where there's a lot of either anti-psychiatry views or anti-vaccine views, and or just alternative medicine ideology products and services, because a lot of them, there's a lot of reasons that people fall for such misinformation and propaganda. There's, it happens at the level of the individual. It happens at the social level where people are targeted with such misinformation. We're talking about identity factors, community, as you mentioned. So there's lots of good reasons for why those things kind of coalesce. I think I just posted today, and we have empirical support on it. It's kind of an unsavory term, which I do mention in the book, but there's a term called crank magnetism, which is an idea that describes the phenomena whereby belief in one kind of pseudoscience or conspiracy tends to attract another, kind of like a magnet, this kind of crank magnetism. And the reason for that is this underlying, psychological underpinnings. And so it's almost regardless of the content, people are feeding into the same kinds of, like I mentioned, kind of personality traits, and or just buying into a narrative that is very polarizing and divisive and us versus them, very mainstream medicine is wrong, anti-intellectualism, the experts are wrong, we're right, we have the solutions. That's all part of the narrative.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And, and you asked, like, is it worse today? My view, for what it's worth, is, I think it's far worse today for at least two reasons, if not more. One is I think the era of social media has really amplified the mess that we're in. Again, we have empirical data that shows that false information, even on X algorithms, or what was Twitter algorithms, false information travels further, faster, and deeper than truthful information. There's actually a study on that, which is, it's an old adage that, false information travels across the world faster. But we actually have empirical support for that. And social media is amplifying that spread, which is incredibly dangerous. And in part, that's because so much of it, again, is polarizing and divisive and emotion laden and hyped and oversimplified, that really pulls and attracts to our heuristics and our own personal biases. So I think social media has done, hor- it's nuanced, right? Social media does really great things, and then that's kind of the dark side of it. There's other studies that have come out, at least in my realm of in the world of mental health, where we see that the top TikTok videos on, say, ADHD, or just on mental health more generally. A lot of them are very misleading videos, and these videos are viewed millions and literally billions of times. So that speaks to the dissemination and the pervasiveness of it. So that's one factor that I think that contributes to why it's worse, is social media. The other factor, which is the tragedy, which I believe is because science has become incredibly politicized in the last several years, and increasingly now in the US with the new administration and the whole MAHA movement, which now we're getting pseudoscience literally baked into the institutions, where it's an anti-science movement. Grants are being cut, people are being fired, and the head of the US healthcare system is bringing in his own ideologically bent people to spread the propaganda that he's been doing for decades.
Yeah, it's a pattern we've seen before in governments and situations, going back many decades, when government regulatory bodies that are supposed to be overseeing or promoting science and scientific literacy, when they are taken over by ideologues with an agenda, whether we're talking about things in Europe, things here, trouble inevitably follows, and it can be violently harmful to people. This is where I think this meeting of the sort of cult thinking and health world come together in a disturbing way. And right now, as you mentioned, RFK Jr. Is the head of our health and human services, and there's a lot of words, but reliable scientific thinker is not how to describe that man. And I'm just going to be super kind today and not get ranty. But we're in a situation, and medical professionals around the United States, on social media, off social media, have openly called for his resignation, because the things that he promotes, his waffling back and forth on the efficacy of vaccines. He'll make public statements, basically to cater to whatever audience or message he's trying to convince people of in the moment, rather than hold a position of scientific integrity. So that's the situation we're in right now, and so it's a vast concern to me. How do we, let's get down to the rubber meets the road on this, though, in terms of helping people with this. What are your general markers for pseudoscience, right? It's not crazy people thinking crazy things. It's people generally have, especially when you get into the vaccine, anti-vax debates, they'll bring scientific literature out. They'll bring, chemistry and cytology and all these things. And it's not like they're not trying to do the work or be good critical thinkers, and yet they keep coming up with these goofball wrong answers. And what are the markers here? How do we see the good from the bad, the wheat from the chaff? How do we do that?
There's a lot to it, and so one way in which I try to help people understand, at least in my book, is to look for pseudoscientific warning signs, or like you said, markers. In my book, I have a list of them, literally at the back of the chapter, or the back of the book, and I spend an entire chapter trying to elucidate those warning signs. I want people to memorize them if they can, because as you said, I think that's what can help people strengthen their grift detectors, so to speak. So there's 9 of them. There's a number of them. One is particularly important, and in my view, it really helps separate the wheat from the chaff, which is this idea where claims are divorced from the broader scientific literature. So, meaning, I can put it in the context of alternative medicine. So, for example, no matter how many studies might find uh, a positive outcome for, say, homeopathy or energy healing, the mechanisms of those treatments, homeopathy and energy healing, are completely divorced from the broader scientific literature. Because, for example, homeopathy is a treatment that says that the more times we dilute a substance, the more effective it becomes, to the point where we literally dilute the substance out of existence. There's not a molecule left in the remedy. It's literally just water or sugar or some other contaminant or alcohol. There's no remedy of it. And so that's according to the theory of homeopathy. This stuff, it just can't happen. And according to homeopathy, water somehow remembers the molecules that are in it. And so it's just a very bizarre pseudoscientific theory. And so that's completely divorced from the literature. And same with energy healing, where it purports that we have these human energy fields around us and that a practitioner can somehow manipulate and balance our energy without touch. So those claims are divorced from the broader scientific literature. There's other claims, for example, that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has made, which are completely divorced from the broader scientific literature. For example, he says that vaccines cause autism. They do not. We have very, very strong, overwhelming evidence that they don't. And another one, I posted a clip where he was claiming that HIV does not cause AIDS. I mean, this is bordering on germ theory denialism, which is the idea that for viruses don't cause germs. So right away, that should put people's spidey senses up, and that's one of the strongest pseudoscientific indicators that we have. But there's other pseudoscientific indicators like elevating anecdotal evidence, testimonials to say this treatment works or this claim works, or using sciencey sounding language, reversing the burden of proof onto skeptics rather um, than cynics to make their claims. And so there's a lot of these kinds of warning signs. Even and then it comes down to marketing as well, like watching for, again, oversimplified waffling, as you've mentioned. Like RFK Jr. was at one point selling fluoride water, and now he's responsible for banning fluoride in drinking water. It's like, well, where it makes you really kind of question the motives there. And so and then there was a Maha report where they were literally caught using AI to generate fake references in the reference section that didn't exist. They contacted the authors of that Maha report, and the author said, "Yeah, that's my research team. We never conducted that study. That study doesn't exist." And that happened on at least 4 times. And then when Maha or the Maha report was called on it, they just said it's a formatting error, and they didn't take responsibility for it. So that's another, like, where's the transparency there where they're calling for transparency? So lots of different red flags, pseudoscientific markers. I'd love to go through all of them, but that's sort of the
No,
point of the
that's
chapter.
good.
But that's a
Yeah.
huge one, and for me, that's the biggest one. That scientific plausibility one, where it's like making just claims that the vast majority of healthcare professionals and scientists around the world would just debunk. For example, vaccines cause autism, or that HIV doesn't cause AIDS. I mean, that's just ridiculous. And this is the head of the U.S. healthcare system stating this stuff.
Yeah, it's quite something when you have people in positions of power repeating these nonsensical conspiracy theories and nonsense. The fluoride in the water thing, another great example. Um, There's another. Maybe you mentioned marketing. What immediately comes to mind for me in terms of compare and contrast are as annoying as they are when because I really hate pharmaceutical advertising and commercials. But you get this litany of side effects that they sort of rush through during the middle of the commercial, right? While they're showing B-roll of happy people walking around having picnics. So I'm not, like all down with, the marketing of psychotropics and all that. But the point is that when they market them, they are regulated and they have to tell you about the side effects. They have to tell you about things that can happen to you as a negative result of this. I never, ever see such conditionals or statements made in any of the anecdotes or marketing materials for any pseudoscientific stuff. You'll never see a homeopathy ad. And this could also cause you, right? Is that a marker?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I want to make really clear too, like big pharma doesn't get a pass in any of this. I mean, it has an awful history of conflicts of interest and corrupt research, and again, like that marketing, that that disingenuous marketing. And so the solution to big pharma, though, the solution to the gaps in our knowledge and the gaps in our healthcare system, is to be more transparent, to have better science, better access and availability of evidence-based treatments, and more ethical and competent care. The solution is not the wellness industry, the $5.6 trillion wellness industry that, like you said, is largely unregulated and purports to fill the gaps in our knowledge with this kind of pseudoscientific culk, so to speak. It's with financial and emotional exploitation of patients, and by oversimplifying and hyping claims that are very often pseudoscientific or unsupported, with no disclaimers at all. And so that's the grift. And it's a bit worse than that, because that, like we mentioned before, the wellness industry and alternative medicine ideology and Maha itself is based on that polarizing, divisive narrative. It needs that. So it's not just that they promote their own products. They promote it in the context of mainstream medicine is wrong, experts are wrong, evidence-based healthcare is wrong, we're right, we know what we're doing. And that's what's happening at the institutional level now, where Maha is able to effectively get rid of science, grants, and people in positions of power who are actually experts, and he's filling them with his own ideologues, as you said.
Yeah, it's wild. I think another way that people can recognize when they're being, sold a bill of goods, the hype, the over promising seems to be a very common, again, maybe marketing tactic, but the language itself, when you're promising results, cures, relief from things, and the language is so absolutist and so conflict driven. It seems like a lot of it is also positioned with they're wrong, we're right. It's like kind of baked into the thing as in the messaging of it. And you don't see doctors talk like that.
No, you're right, because that's a hallmark of pseudoscience. It's literally the antithesis of science, because science, by definition, is very iterative, tentative, evolving, nuanced, probabilistic. That's the languaging that we're trained to use when we're doing research grants and scientific studies, and we're very careful with our languaging. In the wellness world and in the pseudoscience world, it's the opposite. It's, like you said, it's just very categorical, black and white thinking. We have the cure, we have the promise, and that's a pseudoscientific warning sign. It's false marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really no different than come in to, get some Dianetics and we'll cure your leukemia. It's like, what are you talking about? But to Dianeticists and Scientologists, oh yeah, absolutely. Because it's not something wrong with your body, it's something wrong with your spirit, and you
Yes.
can bring in this whole other thing. There's an
And
interesting,
it's worse
yeah,
than that, Chris, because it's not only can Dianetics cure you, but it's that evidence-based healthcare professionals and big pharma and everyone else, they are suppressing the cancer cure because they want to keep you sick. That's the narrative, right?
yes,
It
yes.
still needs that polarizing, they're wrong, we're right, here's our solution.
Yeah, big time. There are, I think it would not be, too far a beam to say we are suffering a crisis of trust in our institutions these days, both ideological and scientific, um, and academic, even, right? The universities have horrible reputations right now. And this is sometimes warranted in some ways and not in other ways. And I was curious that as someone who works in the industry, is a medical professional, in looking back over, say, COVID, something I think of as a World War, size event without bombs, but every single person on the planet was affected by it, and from pole to pole, and and it feels like the net result of that whole pandemic, while we saw an incredible feat of speed and scientific engineering and medical professionals coming together to work together to bring vaccines out within, what was it, a year and a half of the thing happening, an unprecedented event, really, scientifically and medically speaking. We see the public negatively responding to this. They kept changing their minds. It was all, Fauci and this and that, and lab leaks and conspiracy theories and hidden enemies and hidden agendas. What's your take on that whole thing, and what could have maybe been done better? Again, it's all hindsight quarterbacking. I understand that, but we've got to repair this lack of trust and this breaking of faith with our institutions. And I'm curious from within the profession how you all see this.
I, Help me understand it. I think of it as a dialectic, meaning there's multiple truths happening. It's not one, and there's two kind of parallel processes happening. So one is, like you said, it was sort of an unprecedented thing in the pandemic where the public, the world, got to see science unfold before the very eyes. They got a front row seat. It's science is now naked. I mean, if you didn't have an interest in science before, you certainly were forced to now. So you got to see how science got to be conducted, which again is very iterative and tentative and hard and evolving, and it can change. And policymakers are left trying to make the best decisions based on the best evidence, which can change over time. And so, for some people, that did foster a lot of mistrust. For other people, they kind of knew that because that's kind of how science unfolds. But that was really unsettling for a lot of people. And when politicians kind of make policy decisions on that, and it may vary depending on countries and jurisdictions, that it's normal to have a kind of mistrust environment be fostered in that. And so it is important for scientists and academics to be very transparent and open and honest about what informs their decisions. So that was happening on one level and one layer. The other layer is, again, these anti science narratives, which made it far, far worse because they saw that tentative process. And what do? Anti science movements are now positioned to latch on to what's happening, amplify the hell out of that distrust, and literally profit from it at the expense of public health. And so they will take the tentative nature of science again and then distort it and push propaganda and say, look, again, they don't know what they're doing, they know nothing. And it really boosted these anti-science movements to the point that the anti-vaccine movement is now in the White House. So that is incredibly dangerous. And that was a parallel process happening at the same time. So you had experts out there trying to debunk the misinformation and propaganda coming from these anti-science movements. And it's very hard for the general public to navigate what the hell is going on because they're getting a lot of mixed messaging. And that's a terrible tragedy because again, on the one hand, this is how science works, and science is a very fallible human endeavor. And again, our experts and our academics and scientists need to be transparent about that. But then we had a movement that amplified and profited from that mistrust and got to sell their own ideology. And that's extremely dangerous. And we're paying the price for it now.
Yeah, for sure. Do you see efforts to push, not just push back, efforts like this right here today? I mean, that's what we're trying to do, push back a bit on this. Are there proactive measures being taken, or are you aware of them, to educate, inform, fill the void, right? The vaccine stuff, for example. There's just constant streams of misinformation about this. But in addition to just saying, well, that's misinformation, 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 what else can we bring to the table to help ease tensions and bring some sense of trust back to medicine?
I wish I knew, Chris. I mean, I think it's a multi-pronged solution. I don't feign expertise at the sociological or the social level or the policy level. I wish I knew how to
Fair
address
enough.
that at that level. My
Yeah.
intention with the book was because I'm a clinical psychologist, so I work with people at the individual level. And my intention with the book was try to help people defend themselves and empower themselves to be able to spot such misinformation and propaganda to protect themselves and their loved ones. But you're right. It has to be more than that. I don't know what those solutions are. We have the individual level where we improve science literacy, health literacy. We teach people the language of pseudoscientific grift and alternative medicine and wellness ideology to better position themselves to defend themselves against this kind of stuff. But we also need these policy level decisions, which I don't know. There's a huge science communication community out there, which is exactly what we're doing, trying to help people. I think there's probably a role for more organized entities like organized pediatricians and organized psychologists and organized medical professionals to kind of come together and issue their own statements, issuing making the public aware of the scientific consensus and kind of where people are at right now. But it's very very difficult, especially when we get there's something called the Einstein effect, which is it's a psychological phenomenon where we're more likely to believe misinformation and propaganda from an MD or a PhD or a scientist than say a wellness guru because it lends a modicum of legitimacy. And so you get guys in Maha who do have MDs and PhDs, and so they're seemingly respectable physicians or professionals. But again, their claims are disconnected from the body and the mountains of scientific consensus that we have, and that's a very hard thing for the general public to navigate. So I think that there is a role for kind of larger scale organizations, ones that aren't corrupted. If I used to point people to the CDC, now I won't because it's part of Maha. So it's a very
Yeah.
tricky solution. I wish I knew, Chris. I wish I knew.
I hear you. I do. Because in the cult field, it's no different, right? I mean, on an individual level, and this is where you and I operate, we can help people one on one. We can work with them. We can do interventions. We can do post cult work or whatever, right? And educate and inform. And once people sort of have that, that moment of break from these belief systems, these very totalist kind of belief systems and very conspiratorial. There was an observation about this that I wanted to share with you. I wanted to get your take on this, because I think it's maybe a very subtle. You kind of have to think a little bit about it, to see it. But the thing that seems to a common denominator of conspiracy thinking seems to be the enemy is unknown. There's an agenda driven by forces you don't know about. And that mystery, I think, glues people psychologically to the conspiracy idea, because hidden forces, mysterious elements in our society, like the enemy, suddenly becomes everywhere and nowhere. And this can generate an awful lot of fear or insecurity at best. What do you think about that idea as a clinical psychologist?
I think that's true. It certainly resonates. I mean, I think that's one of the psychological variables that contribute to what's called conspiracy mentality or why people buy into conspiracies. It's a kind of, and I don't say this term lightly, but or to stigmatize anyone, but it's a kind of paranoid thinking. It doesn't
Hmm.
mean that someone is psychotic or that they have schizophrenia, because those are very different scientific constructs. But it's just sort of this style of thinking that is associated with buying into conspiracies. It doesn't mean that someone's mentally ill either, because a lot of people can buy into conspiracies. There's studies that where it found that over 50% of the US population before COVID bought into at least one medical conspiracy. So it's much more common than people believe. The other thing I'd say to that is that there's a really fantastic researcher and psychiatrist who actually just published a book on conspiracies called False. His name is Joe Pierre. He's a friend and colleague of mine, and I've learned a lot from him about the nature of conspiracies. And one of his academic papers talked about how mistrust is the cornerstone of conspiracy mentality. And so he puts forth the model. And so that mistrust is kind of related to that kind of paranoid thinking, where there is just sort of this in the background, this just general mistrust of everything, of authority, of people, of they, and that kind of general mistrust of the world is what drives a lot of these conspiracy mentality beliefs. And so it doesn't really matter what content you plug in, whether it's flat Earth or anti-psychiatry or anti-vaccine or whatever it might be, aliens, lizard people. It's sort of a mistrust for them who are coming after us, and so that's a huge psychological component as well.
Absolutely. And I will just, sort of, since it's adjacent, from neither one of us are social psychologists, but we can talk about this. We're just chatting. To me, what you just said is actually sort of describing the nature of the acid that corrodes our social bonds and our social institutions, right? And the trust in them is this generalized mistrust, right? This feeling that they are lying to us, and of course we're sitting here saying, well, these pseudoscientific folks are lying to you. I mean, we're sowing distrust, and I think that's why we try to talk about, well, why would they be doing this, and of course there's a profit motive, but there's also uh emotional needs, right? The feeling that medicine hasn't worked for me, so therefore I must look to alternative methods or means. Or if the distrust is sown too strongly, they never even go for the medical; they just go straight to the alternative.
Yes.
I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's true that there's another variable for what helps account for why people fall for conspiracies, and sort of this idea of lack of control. And so kind of like
Mm.
the uncertainty in the environment. And so what conspiracies or cults or that kind of marriage to pseudoscientific beliefs can do is help provide a worldview for people, and sort of a sense of identity. It helps them kind of understand their world, even though it's sort of an inaccurate depiction of the world. It kind of feels safe. It's like, I can't trust anyone, but here's why. These people are telling me why. And so that's the information. And now I can understand it a bit more. And that's a very dangerous thing. There's empirical studies on this stuff where, they've brought people into the lab, and you can give people random kind of dots or random, random kind of, they're not patterns yet, but they're just random dots, say. And if we induce anxiety, say, in people, they are more compelled to see it's called illusory pattern perception. They're more likely to impose a pattern onto these random variations to try to help account or reduce that anxiety. There's the whole psychological literature on this kind of illusory pattern perception. And in some ways, that's what conspiracies do. They try to reduce that anxiety, reduce that uncertainty to a model of the world, but that model of the world is incomplete, and sometimes unfortunately quite harmful, and it can then alienate family, friendships, relationships in one way. And then again, with the advent of social media, because we asked why is it worse nowadays? For some people, it can actually provide community, right? Because you go on to a Reddit forum or something else, and you can say, see, everyone else thinks like me and they believe me, and now you're down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, for sure. I was going to bring that exact one up because sense of community and social cohesion is an emotional need. You know, it's something we have to. It's a bucket we have to fill to whatever degree we need it in order to feel like we are happy or satisfied or have a life worth living. That's what emotional needs are all about. When I use that term, I'm not talking about in the moment emotional reactions. These needs are longer term things.
Yes.
Um,
I can just go off that too for a moment because it
yeah.
reminds me of the work of my friend and colleague Timothy Caulfield, who's a professor at the University of Alberta in health law and policy. He's been studying misinformation and propaganda literally for decades. And what a lot of his recent research is finding is that, which we know, science has become so heavily politicized nowadays that it's almost a uh, it's almost an identity flag, meaning that you can probably predict what kind of scientific information someone will believe based on their identity, their political identity. And for whatever reason, now we're seeing it on the right that a lot of far right or right people who identify politically right will endorse, they're more likely to endorse conspiracies and these kinds of pseudoscientific information, misinformation. Historically, it was a lot on the left, but now in this cultural milieu, it kind of shifted to the right. And so,
Mm,
and again, when we're talking about identity, it's like, well, you know, you can give someone the same piece of information, and that piece of information will be filtered differently through the lens of our belief systems, right? And our sense of personal identity and our sense of community. So, same piece of information will be read differently and seen differently or interpreted differently based on whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And the reason for that is it's part of our identities, it's part of our belief systems. And so, if we try to tell people that they're wrong, we're poking and prodding their worldviews, not just their personal identity, but also their community identity. So it's almost like waging, sports teams against each other. It's sort of this
yes.
tribalistic part of our human psyche.
I could not agree with you more on that. I think that's exactly what we're running into. The melding of ideology and health science. Oh boy. And I think again, COVID was a real big springboard for that for a lot of people, because it was overwhelming. I mean, we were suddenly, all these restrictions and all these barriers to our freedoms and this kind of thing. And legit, I mean, I get it. People couldn't go
Yeah.
to work, they couldn't take their kids to school. They felt
Yeah.
I'm being imposed upon in a survival threatening way,
Yeah.
and yet I'm being told, well, if I go outside, that's going to threaten my survival too. So, uh,
Well,
uh,
and
you
think
know,
if you're people that you're already predisposed to mistrust and you're predisposed to conspiracy thinking, and then we give them a reason like COVID-19, the pandemic, and sort of that mistrust that was sort of fostered unintentionally by our agencies and our politicians. And then you got the anti-vax science movements coming in, and they're the safe haven, and they're giving those people that explanation and that worldview. No wonder it sort of rose to prominence. These sort of anti-science movements.
yeah, I've taken this approach with myself, and I wonder, I wanted to ask you about this, and you work with people. I, um, I try to go a little, like there's all this information. There's this layer of information, and then there's the layer of, the emotional needs. And I think that if we paid a little bit more attention to our internal monologue and our internal feelings on some of this, we might be able to check ourselves before we wreck ourselves. Um, and by that I mean we can use the information that we accumulate, whether in a conspiratorial or whatever way we get it, whether it's coming from Alex Jones or David Icke or RFK Jr. or wherever. Um, but I think if we monitor the feelings, and that's why I bring up the distrust and the sort of the enemy that is everywhere and nowhere. If I start feeling that way now, I'm looking inward. I'm like, wait a second, why am I feeling this way? What's making me feel like the world is this very, very out of control, dangerous place. And all these people who have degrees and have spent all this time in school, they're all working together against me, right? Or against us. And, and they want to suppress the cure for cancer because it's profit. Well, you see the corporations, you see what they do. And you're like, well, profit motive sure as hell makes a lot of sense to me as to why somebody would do bad things. Look at all the bad things they do for profit motive. Why not this? And we go, well, that's ridiculous. And now we're fighting at the fact level, but it's the feeling that's really, I think, creating the conflict. It's this, I'm distrustful. I'm even to the point of paranoia. And if I find myself feeling that way now, I go, hang on. This is wrong. I shouldn't be feeling this way, regardless of which side I'm on. I should feel certain and secure, and I should feel like I have a positive, compassionate feeling toward people. To me, that's my litmus test for whether I'm off the rails or not. Am I hating people, or am I, kind of wanting to help them? And of course, I'm human just like anybody else, so I'm going to have my days, but in a general sense, right? What are your thoughts as a psychologist on that sort of introspection and addressing ourselves at that level?
From a clinical psychology point of view, I mean, that's kind of what we do in therapy. We try to help people increase their emotional awareness, to try to get them to um, understand what their emotions are telling them, so that they can go back and kind of process that stuff. Because I work in the area of addiction and mental health, and often what people do in addiction is kind of numb emotions and kind of suppress them and ignore them. And even in mental health concerns, where depressive thoughts are sort of they're telling us mixed messages that people are wrong and bad. And so we're a lot of what we do in therapy is trying to, yeah, increase that emotional awareness and emotion regulation. And I do think that it's super important when it comes to, it has broader applications outside of therapy, just to kind of critical thinking more generally, which is sort of adopting that kind of intellectual humility that's associated with the scientific spirit. I mean, part of this critical thinking is not just being able to analyze facts, it's learning how to tune into and upset those biases that filter the way in which we see the world and filter our information. And our emotional states are a portal into that, a portal into our biases and portal into our belief systems. So if we can pause, slow down, ask ourselves, why am I so worked up? What are these uncomfortable feelings about? Where are they coming from? And literally try to process it, then we better position ourselves to then analyze the actual content of the information in front of us, which I think is that to me, that's a hallmark of critical thinking. So that's really
Absolutely. And
awesome.
yeah, right. It's that welding of our emotional intelligence and critical thinking that is the key to our ability to be rational. And that's because we're not, my hot take, right, and far from original thinking to me, but we're not thinking creatures who feel. We are feeling creatures who just happen to think sometimes. you
Yes,
know? But an awful lot of the frontal lobe activity seems to be directed to justifying our feelings or our beliefs rather than the other way around. And so I think that's why it's so crucial to tune into that emotional base that we're operating on, because that's really what's driving our behavior. My take.
it is. And there's an entire misinformation literature, again, kind of Tim Caulfield's kind of work, and there's other amazing researchers, and they find this, very, to me, it's a very non-intuitive finding, but it's like, if we can just pause, slow down, and analyze the content rather than sharing it right away and sort of relying on our intuitive system, then we're less likely to fall for misinformation. A lot of this work derives from Daniel Kahneman and his Nobel Prize winning work, which is that we have two kind of systems of thinking: that very effortless, quick, intuitive thinking that's connected to our beliefs, and then that more deliberate, effortful, analytical thinking, which we have to pause and actually try to access. We want to do more of that when we're analyzing scientific information and health information that's going to guide and inform our health decisions. It's not bad to rely on both kinds of systems. I mean, it's just we want to become more aware of when they're operating on us. And especially if it comes to making health decisions, we don't want to be you relying on gut instinct and old belief systems that we have, which may or may not be accurate. We want to try to use our critical thinking skills to analyze them the best we can.
Yeah, exactly. And it just so happens, by the way, everything we've just been talking about for the last couple of minutes is exactly how I recommend people stay out of cults. It's this is engaging. If it's a gear shift, you know what I mean. It's going from first to second. It's sticking yourself purposefully. It's adjusting how you're thinking, because if you're doing only reactive in the moment thinking, that's how they get you. Right. And they'll use phraseology. And this must exist in the pseudoscientific world. It certainly is in the cult world, where don't think, if you know what's right, you know the right thing to do, right? That here comes the high pressure sales, right? You got, if you wait till tomorrow, it's going to be too late. You're going to talk yourself out of it. You're going to go home and your wife's not going to understand, and blah, 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 and all these things, right? All tuned very, very carefully to get you to not shift gears, not go into the slower mode of thinking, where you really get to process the information and even more importantly, tune down the emotions that you're feeling in the moment that are driving you to feel like I must do this now. And this can be sustained for some time, which is how people will drive themselves right into a culty situation or a coercive relationship. Prince Charming has never looked better than on day one. And here we go. And this is the guy, right? And, whenever you hear about these, we got married in a week, I'm always like, yeah, there it is.
I intuition and gut instincts is often, I think it's romanticized in our culture, in terms of its value. And, there's a place for it on some level, but you're right. I think, marketers and people in cults and the wellness industry capitalizes on that. And when it comes to making health decisions, I don't recommend relying on gut instincts and intuition. We want to rely on the best available evidence, which incidentally is what healthcare professionals are supposed to do. We all have a code of ethics and a legal standards of practice. And in that philosophy of our codes of ethics and legal standards of practice is an obligation to evidence-based care. It's not intuition. It's relying on science.
That's right. That's right. And it occurs to me again, just as another point of compare and contrast. I mean, these are obvious things, but it's good to say them out loud. You don't go into a hospital. I have never, okay, let me put it this way. I have never once not gone to a hospital because I was afraid of the high pressure sales pitch that the doctor was going to lob at me. Right. I have never once had a doctor, and I've had various things. Not once have I gone in there and it's been like, oh, well, look, if you don't do this now, right? Like, it's always, okay, here's the data. Here's what we're looking at. Here's the tests, and go home, think about it, talk to your wife, talk whatever, figure it out. Unless it's obviously, a gunshot, some emergency situation where you're literally bleeding out. And at that point, they're not really asking you too many questions. They're just lay down and let's get to it. So it's, again, it's one of those compare and contrast points, I think.
Yeah, I love that metaphor. And to me, and in the professional or the health professional world, it comes down to informed consent. It's like when it's psychologists, physicians, etc. Like, we're obligated to honesty at the informed consent process, which means that we need to be honest with respect to the risks and the benefits of treatment, to lay it all out in a very transparent and open manner so that the patient can make a decision guided by the best available evidence. You don't see that in the wellness world. They're not being honest and forthright in their consent because they're telling you something like homeopathy or energy healing will treat your depression. And that is inaccurate information. And so the irony there is that it actually doesn't respect patients' autonomy at all, because a patient who can't tell the difference between science and pseudoscience isn't making an informed choice. And it's even worse if the clinician doesn't know the difference, which I think happens in the alternative medicine world.
Yeah, exactly. I've never seen a fact sheet of the pros and cons of homeopathy. And I've worked in a chiropractic office back in my earlier life. And so, we were just surrounded by, every supplement in the world, a whole rack of homeopathy vials of water. and all this stuff. And nowhere in sight are any cautions or any sort of studies or any sort of like breakdowns on this stuff. It's one of those things that I think is really worth pointing out because people don't notice things that aren't there. And so it's just this kind of big omission, and so they don't think about it. Like, wait a minute, well, tell me, Mr. Chiropractor, what are the downsides of taking this supplement? What are the dangers? Because they're not telling you. These are good questions maybe to ask of your healthcare professionals on whether they're alternative or professional. And
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and it reminds me of these tropes too. So like you're right, like you want to ask them about honesty, like, yeah, tell me what are the risks and benefits of this treatment? What are the evidence? But also, it kind of goes back to the tropes and the narratives that I kind of mentioned, where I think that once people can learn to identify these themes and these tropes, it will be hard to unsee. And so that's what I really wanted people to also find. I have lists of them in the book. So, for example, the alternative medicine practitioners only treat the root cause. Mainstream medicine only masks the symptoms. We treat the root cause. But if you dig deeper, the root cause is a false or pseudoscientific root cause, like treating your energy blockages, which is the root cause of your depression, or a diet deficiency that doesn't really exist. So buy our supplements and go into our expensive testing. Another trope is that our treatments are all natural, or they've been used for millions of years, or whatever the hell it is. So we might actually
Cavemen
say
use
that.
this,
Yeah,
so this tea is good for you.
it's been forever. Yeah, our
Yeah.
our fish ancestors, when we were evolving, ate these chemicals in the in the ocean. Like, who knows, right? But it's they'll do that. They'll have these kinds of tropes, and I provided these lists for people because I then encourage them to read the lists, then go and Google literally any alternative medicine clinic website, and you'll find the narrative, you'll find the script, which is that polarizing, divisive narrative. And to me, I think that's helpful in teaching that language of pseudoscience and grift to help raise people's kind of spidey senses, so to speak.
Absolutely. Well, I know we have a limited amount of time today, so we are going to move toward wrapping up right now. But first, I want to say thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me about this today. And I was going to say maybe we should start. Mind the Science is a great title. I'm not at all like critical, but maybe it should be something like watch out for that pseudoscience or something. Some conflict based sort of titling might serve our needs in some fashion.
Yeah, just yeah, use we should get polarizing and divisive and just capitalize on their strategies.
Yeah, exactly. While at the same time, we still need to be able to be taken seriously and really do mind those pros and cons. That really is it's almost the most obvious thing you could see, and I think that's why I chose to harp on that a bit today because it's like because people feel a little powerless and overwhelmed, especially when they are medically challenged or are having issues. Right? They're really not at their 100%, and we have to allow for those kind of things too. But things, common sense advice: take your time, be informed, make sure you have full informed consent. These are important things for having a good long life, and that's what we want for you.
It saddens me too because people are they're not just seeking wellness alternatives or alternative medicine treatments at their best. They're seeking it at their most vulnerable, or when they're facing health conditions and the desperation and the intoxicating desperation of that. And so, who doesn't want to hear that someone can offer them a cure? I mean, so there's very compelling reasons that people turn to these approaches. And what we're trying to do is just to, you know, a lot of these approaches aren't tested for safety and or effectiveness, and we just want people to be able to protect themselves from that.
That's right, exactly. And in fact, this is another point I have to say where the cult and the pseudoscientific world come together, right? Because it is these moments of vulnerability and trauma, even where people are most susceptible to being taken advantage of, and we just don't want you all to be taken advantage of. That's all. How do people find you? I've got your website right there on the screen. Is there any other more direct way or other means of contacting you?
The website is best. It has my contact info there, and otherwise finding me on social media, battling harassers and trolls. And I don't know how much longer I'm going to be doing that stuff, but that's probably the best way is social media and my website.
Excellent. Yeah, I do follow you on Blue Sky, and we used to see each other on Twitter.
Yes.
I had to abandon X. I just couldn't take it
I,
anymore. I just
I
couldn't.
admire you, Chris. I admire you for taking the leap. I'll probably do that one day, but I'm just not quite ready to leave those particular trenches. But I get it. I totally get
Yeah,
it,
it
and I
was just,
admire it.
it was, yeah, it's 100% on me. I love the fight, but when it's bringing you down, you got to do something about that. Now I have one more question. Are any more books in the works?
Not currently, but
Okay.
I really said what I wanted to say in this one. I put my heart and soul into it, everything that I could. Um, and it was the sort of culmination of 7 years of doing this kind of science communication work on social media and trying to help people answer these questions as best as I could. So maybe in another 10 so years, maybe I'll have another one kind of in me. But currently, I'm enjoying my clinical work.
Awesome, man. All right. Well,
Yep.
carry on with that. I'll let you get out of here. Folks, check out the website, check out his book. I really can't recommend it enough. And of course, I hope you found this week's show entertaining, informative, and educational as always, and that you will support the channel and support my work. And I'll see you next week. Bye bye.